Society fundamentally misunderstands the architecture of trauma. We are conditioned to look for the obvious fractures. We search for the bruises. We listen for the shattered glass and the screaming matches. But here is the brutal physical reality. The most profound psychological damage does not require a raised hand. It thrives in perfectly pristine homes. It breeds in quiet living rooms. It is the trauma of absolute absence. A child does not need to be physically beaten to be biologically broken. They simply need to be consistently unseen. They need their existence to register as a zero in the room. Watch closely how a human nervous system adapts. A 7-year-old boy sits on a living room rug. He is carefully connecting plastic building blocks. The front door deadbolt clicks open. Heavy footsteps enter the hallway. The boy does not look up. He does not smile. His shoulders instantly drop half an inch. His respiratory rate shifts to shallow, controlled breathing. His peripheral vision locks onto the doorway frame. His father walks past. The father completely ignores him. The father loudly greets the younger sibling in the next room. The 7-year-old's hands pause for exactly 2 seconds. He swallows hard. His pupils dilate slightly to take in more threat data. He silently attaches another plastic block. He maintains absolute physical stillness. He minimizes his breathing to avoid drawing any attention to his own existence. The actual fatal mechanism is hidden right there. There was absolutely no physical threat in that hallway. No voice was raised. No hand was lifted. Yet the child's brain just registered a catastrophic event. Why does this complete absence of danger trigger the exact same biological stress response as navigating an active war zone? But here is the brutal physical reality. The damage does not end in the silent hallway. It travels instantly into the fundamental neurology of the child. Emotional neglect forces a terrifying biological adaptation. The child does not interpret a caregiver's indifference as a parental failure. They interpret it as a fatal flaw in their own biological makeup. To understand this, look at the precise mechanics of limbic resonance. Mammalian infant brains are not inherently self-regulating. They require the constant, reciprocal exchange of facial expressions and emotional cues. This exchange is the only way a child calibrates their autonomic nervous system. When a child's physical bid for connection meets a blank void, the system crashes. The child's amygdala instantly classifies this unresponsive face as a severe survival threat. The brain signals an immediate crisis. The adrenal glands dump massive quantities of cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream. The heart rate violently spikes. The physiological system prepares to fight or run for its life. But here lies the catastrophic trap. A child cannot physically fight their own caregiver. A child cannot flee from their only source of shelter. With no physical outlet, the nervous system traps this biochemical terror internally. To survive the constant psychological threat of abandonment, the brain alters its physical structure. The child's nervous system forcefully shifts into a dorsal vagal state of shutdown. This shutdown triggers a complex behavioral adaptation known as fawning. The prefrontal cortex physically wires itself to execute a single, dominant command. It begins to systematically suppress the child's own needs. It shuts down the neural pathways associated with desires and emotional pain. The child's brain makes a cold mathematical calculation. A suppressed, totally invisible, hyper-compliant version of the self is the only viable profile. It is the only operational mode that will not provoke further rejection. Watch exactly how this suppression manifests in physical space. A 9-year-old falls off his bicycle in the driveway. His knee hits the concrete, tearing the skin and drawing blood. He gasps from the sharp impact, but his right hand immediately snaps up to clamp over his own mouth. He quickly scans the environment. He locates his mother reading a book 20 feet away on the porch. He deliberately rotates his torso to hide the injury. He angles his bleeding leg entirely away from her line of sight. He limps silently through the back door. He navigates the hallway to the bathroom without a single sound. He turns the faucet on completely cold. He forcefully washes the blood out of the scrape. He does not wince. He does not cry. He applies a bandage in complete isolation. He walks back out to the yard. His facial muscles are rigidly locked into a perfectly neutral expression. He will never mention the injury. The true danger lies in the long-term consequence of this routine. This behavior causes the permanent severing of the brain's interoceptive network. The child literally loses the neurological ability to register their own physical and emotional hunger cues. They are conditioned to view their own bodily sensations as dangerous inconveniences. This biological adaptation is incredibly effective in the short term. It successfully keeps the child safe from conflict under the family roof. But it quietly installs a catastrophic cognitive framework. This exact architecture of suppression will now dictate the exact parameters of every human relationship they will form for the rest of their lives. Watch exactly what happens as this traumatized system reaches adulthood. The emotionally neglected child does not outgrow this architecture. They mature into a highly specialized, hyper-vigilant organism. They learn to weaponize hyper-empathy and absolute self-effacement. They use this strategy to preemptively control exactly how other people perceive them. They must guarantee their own absolute utility to the group. If they are functionally indispensable, they are safe. They calculate that a useful person never has to face the biological terror of being unloved, but the actual fatal mechanism is completely invisible to the outside world. The adult's anterior insula remains in a permanent state of chronic hyper-arousal. This is the specific brain region responsible for processing social emotions. Society labels their behavior as profound kindness or exceptional listening skills. Society is entirely wrong. This is a highly advanced, automated defense mechanism. They deploy cognitive empathy as a sophisticated radar system. Their brain constantly scans the micro-expressions of everyone in the room. They analyze vocal tonalities and physical posturing for the slightest deviation. They are actively detecting potential conflict or microscopic dissatisfaction. They must neutralize these social threats immediately. They must do this long before the dissatisfaction can escalate into abandonment. And it gets worse. Clinical psychology defines this extreme adaptation as echoism. It is the exact opposite of narcissism. It is the paralyzing physiological terror of seeming burdensome or taking up physical space. When asked for a simple personal preference, a brutal internal suppression occurs. The individual's prefrontal cortex actively blocks the neural pathways associated with personal desire. They literally cannot access the data of what they want. The brain perceives the assertion of a personal boundary as a fatal error. Setting a boundary is not processed as an act of healthy self-respect. It is processed as an immediate, life-threatening risk to their primary attachment bonds. Carefully observe this pathology in a mundane environment. A 30-year-old professional lies in bed. The digital clock reads 11:45 p.m. The phone vibrates loudly on the nightstand. It is a text message from a casual acquaintance. The acquaintance is asking for urgent help editing a resume. The professional is severely exhausted. Their eyes are bloodshot and their physical muscles ache. Their heart rate elevates sharply in immediate, natural frustration, yet their thumbs instantly move to the glass screen. Their facial muscles involuntarily contract into a forced, polite smile. They are alone in a dark room, yet they are still performing compliance. They type the response without a single second of hesitation. Absolutely. Send it over now. Happy to look at it tonight. They physically sit up in the cold bed. They rub their temples to temporarily suppress the physical exhaustion. They open the laptop and spend the next 2 uninterrupted hours meticulously editing the document. They execute this task in complete silence. This creates a severe, chronic depletion of the body's allostatic load. The biological cost of continuously overriding the autonomic nervous system is staggering. The body cannot indefinitely sustain this level of self-abandonment. It leads directly to unexplained somatic illnesses and chronic physical fatigue. It triggers a terrifying, complete loss of individual identity. By successfully making themselves completely indispensable to everyone around them, they set a permanent trap. They lock their nervous system into a rigid, inescapable behavioral loop. This loop drives them directly toward a silent, mathematically inevitable psychological collapse. The hyper-accommodating adult operates on a covert psychological contract. It is a deeply flawed, unspoken mathematical equation. They believe that if they perfectly anticipate everyone else's needs, a rescue will occur. They calculate that someone eventually will anticipate theirs. But this contract is a complete biological fiction. When this exact contract inevitably fails, the cognitive dissonance is violent. It physically shatters their entire operational framework. The actual fatal mechanism is hidden in the brain's reward architecture. Look specifically at the ventral tegmental area. Watch how it projects directly into the nucleus accumbens. This specific neural pathway strictly requires reciprocal social validation. It needs a reciprocal signal to release a baseline level of dopamine. It operates on an exact necessary input-output ratio. By perpetually giving, the individual continuously starves this neural network. By never allowing themselves to receive, they force a critical deficit. They subject their own brain to severe, chronic dopamine depletion. The physical manifestation of this starvation is anhedonia. It is a profound physiological inability to process joy. They literally lose the biological capacity to feel basic human satisfaction. Their external life may appear highly successful and stable to outside observers. Internally, their neurological reward system has completely flatlined, and it gets worse. Eventually, the individual's nervous system registers a crushing data point. They realize their immense, continuous sacrifices are completely unreciprocated. This triggers a highly specific, intense form of betrayal trauma. But their childhood conditioning immediately intercepts the natural stress response. The original survival programming explicitly forbids them from projecting anger outward. Directing anger toward an adult caregiver was historically dangerous. Therefore, the brain's default mode network forcefully reroutes the aggression. It violently redirects the anger inward, targeting the self. The brain must rationalize this profound lack of reciprocity to maintain a sense of safety. It arrives at a single devastating conclusion. I am fundamentally defective. I simply have not worked hard enough to earn love yet. Carefully observe what this specific breaking point looks like in physical reality. A woman sits in the driver's seat of her sedan. The car is parked perfectly in her own driveway. She has just completed a grueling 14-hour day of emotional labor. She flawlessly accommodated the demands of her boss, her partner, and 2 friends. She turns off the ignition. The engine ticks softly as the metal cools. She does not reach for her leather bag on the passenger seat. She does not reach down to unclasp her seatbelt. She simply stares straight ahead at the white panels of the garage door. Her hands drop slowly from the 10 and 2 position. They rest entirely limply on the bottom arc of the steering wheel. 10 full minutes pass in complete, motionless silence. 20 minutes pass. The ambient temperature in the cabin steadily drops. She feels a heavy physical density expanding inside her chest cavity. It is a hollow, suffocating, leaden sensation, but absolutely no tears come. Her tear ducts remain completely dry. She is physiologically immobilized. She is entirely drained of basic executive function. She literally lacks the neurological chemical impulse required to lift her arm. She cannot perform the simple task of pulling the door handle. She cannot walk 30 feet to enter her own home. Clinical literature refers to this exact moment as the hollow break. It is a paralyzing episode of total systemic failure. The internal motivation engine completely seizes. The biological machinery simply refuses to run another compliance cycle. This catastrophic failure forces a terrifying confrontation. The individual must face the fact that performing a life is not the same as living one. Hitting this absolute zero of emotional output is a terrifying physical experience. But here is the brutal physical reality. This total systemic crash is a strict, non-negotiable biological prerequisite. It is the only absolute requirement for dismantling a rigged cognitive framework. Healing from invisible trauma is not a cinematic epiphany. It does not arrive as a warm wave of sudden emotional realization. It is a cold, calculated, and highly disruptive physical process. To exist fully as a biological organism, you must confront a devastating physical truth. The version of you that everyone relied upon was a fabrication. The version of you they continuously praised was not a personality. It was a highly specialized, automated trauma response. The real you will be profoundly inconvenient to the people around you. The honest version of your nervous system will permanently disrupt the social ecosystem you built. Rewriting this deeply entrenched neurological script is brutal. It requires the daily, incredibly uncomfortable practice of actively disappointing other human beings. You must mathematically calculate that their temporary disappointment is required to physically save yourself. You must forcibly install a new operating system. You must become the fiercely protective parent to your own biology that you never had. This mechanical rewrite begins with the 48-hour delay protocol. You must physically sever the brain's automatic compliance loop. When presented with any external request, your immediate verbal output is barred. You are strictly forbidden from answering in the moment. You must deploy a rigid, memorized script. I need to check my capacity. I will let you know tomorrow. You will feel a violent internal spike of panic when you say this. Your heart rate will accelerate as the brain anticipates rejection. Force your nervous system to endure the physical pause anyway. Next, you must execute interoceptive mapping. You have to deliberately rebuild the severed neural pathways to your own bodily sensations. Run this specific physical scan 3 times a day. Locate a distinct physical state in your body and explicitly link it to a suppressed emotion. Speak the specific data out loud to yourself. My jaw is rigidly clenched. I am currently experiencing unexpressed resentment. Do not try to quickly stretch or fix the physical tension. Simply force the prefrontal cortex to log the biological reality of the emotion. Finally, execute the boundary toleration exercise. You must actively reject a completely trivial micro-request. Decline an unnecessary calendar, invite or verbally refuse a small favor. The physical reaction of your body will be immediate and intense. After delivering the refusal, you must physically sit still for exactly 10 minutes. You are absolutely forbidden from sending an apologetic text message. You are barred from sending an over-explaining email to soften the blow. You must biologically endure the severe physiological spike of assumed guilt. Your body will prepare for an attack. Your palms will sweat. You must sit completely still inside that terror. You must wait until your nervous system processes a new physical reality. No one is coming into the room to punish you. You have spent your entire life operating as an emotional transaction. Your biology is severely exhausted from the continuous performance. If you are ready to systematically dismantle the trauma responses, dictating your physical existence, subscribe to this channel. This entire process will be profoundly uncomfortable, but here is the brutal physical reality. It is the absolute only path out of the silence.